The village of Thornfield nestled into the Cotswolds like a sleeping cat, comfortable and undisturbed by the hurried world beyond its ancient stone walls. December had wrapped the town in its gentlest costume. Frost-kissed gardens, wreaths of holly adorning cottage doors, and the warm glow of gas lamps reflecting off shop windows lined with tinsel and coloured glass. The high street, barely wide enough for 2 motor cars to pass, had transformed into something from a Victorian postcard, the sort that made tourists sigh and wish they lived in such a place. Miss Jane Marple observed all of this from her particular vantage point, the window seat of the spinning wheel tea room, where she sat with her knitting and her Earl Grey, watching the village pulse with its pre-Christmas rhythm. At 84, she had reached that blessed age where she could observe society without apology, her quiet presence so ordinary that people seemed to forget she was listening at all. The most exciting event of the season, by all accounts, would be the opening of Celestial Treasures, the new toy shop that had recently taken over the old Hartwell premises on the corner of High Street and Station Road. The proprietor was a man named Vincent Ashford, newly arrived from London, a widower of some means who had apparently decided to indulge in the pleasant business of selling toys to the children of Thornfield and its surrounding villages. Mr. Ashford, from what Miss Marple had observed during his weeks of preparation, was a peculiar sort of man. Tall, thin, with silver hair and the manner of someone accustomed to refined society. He had spared no expense in creating his shop. The front window was a masterpiece, an elaborate Christmas village complete with tiny gas lamps, miniature shops, and dozens of dolls in Victorian dress, each one positioned as though attending a grand ball in a ballroom of glittering snow and crystal. The dolls were rather extraordinary, Miss Marple thought. They had been imported from France, someone had mentioned, expensive, delicately painted, with real human hair and glass eyes that seemed to follow one across the display. Some of the village mothers had taken to bringing their daughters to stare at the window each afternoon, though Miss Marple suspected the dolls inspired equal parts wonder and unease in the younger set. There was something almost too lifelike about them, something that suggested they might blink if no one was watching. This morning, the morning of the grand opening, was unseasonably crisp and clear. Miss Marple had dressed warmly, her good grey wool coat, the one with the silver buttons, and her sensible shoes. She had promised to attend the opening ceremony at 11 o'clock. Mrs. Timmins from the village council had enlisted her as part of the welcoming committee, a task that involved standing about, making pleasant conversation, and observing human nature. 3 activities Miss Marple found equally agreeable. The high street was already busy by 10 o'clock. Shop owners had closed their doors to attend. Mrs. Hastings, who ran the greengrocer's, stood chatting animatedly with the vicar's wife, both of them dressed in their best visiting clothes. The Weatherby twins, now in their 50s but still referred to by their childhood names, stood examining the window display with the intensity of art critics. Young Mr. Parkinson, the solicitor, had positioned himself near the shop entrance, apparently intending to be among the first inside. What caught Miss Marple's attention, however, was a young woman standing slightly apart from the gathering crowd. She was perhaps 25, with red blonde hair barely visible beneath a navy cloche hat, and she wore a dress that, while respectable, suggested London tailoring and London taste. She stood watching the toy shop window with an expression that mingled longing and something else. Something Miss Marple recognized as professional assessment. The woman's fingers worked unconsciously, as though she were mentally taking inventory of the display, calculating its worth. An artist, perhaps, or someone with a merchant's eye. At precisely 11 o'clock, Mr. Vincent Ashford emerged from the shop to open the doors formally. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit, his silver hair gleaming in the winter sunlight. He smiled, a practiced smile that nonetheless possessed genuine warmth, and welcomed everyone inside. The crowd flowed in with the restrained enthusiasm typical of English villages, eager enough to seem grateful, polite enough not to appear desperate. The interior of Celestial Treasures was every bit as enchanting as the window promised. Shelves lined with dolls of varying sizes and origins, wooden toys, tin soldiers, music boxes, doll houses with rooms furnished in meticulous detail, rocking horses with real manes of horsehair, books of fairy tales bound in leather, games and puzzles stacked with mathematical precision. Mr. Ashford moved through the shop like a benevolent professor, greeting customers, answering questions about the provenance of various items. He seemed genuinely delighted by the interest his merchandise generated. A table had been set up with sherry and small cakes, not quite generous enough to be called lavish, but sufficient to make the occasion feel special. Miss Marple found herself drawn toward the back of the shop, where the most expensive dolls were displayed in a climate-controlled glass case. These were the dolls from the window, and here they could be examined more closely. They were indeed extraordinary, each one a minor masterpiece of craftsmanship. One in particular caught her attention. A doll dressed in a peacock blue silk gown, with black ringlets and dark eyes that seemed to possess an almost unsettling intelligence. Miss Marple turned to find the red-haired woman standing beside her. This close, Miss Marple could see that the woman's eyes were green, sharp, and assessing. "Very lovely," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "In beautiful things," the woman said, not taking her eyes from the display case. Before Miss Marple could respond, a shriek, sudden, piercing, absolutely genuine, split the air from somewhere in the back room of the shop. The conversation around them stopped. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Mr. Ashford's face went very still, and he moved immediately toward the sound. Several of the men, the vicar, Mr. Parkinson, and the postmaster, followed him. What happened next occurred in the way these things always do in small villages, simultaneously and in fragments. Miss Marple, driven by curiosity rather than prudence, found herself moving toward the commotion along with everyone else. The backroom door, previously closed, swung wide open. There, slumped across a shipping crate, lay a body. It took Miss Marple's sharp eyes only a moment to register that the figure was dead, had been dead for some hours, and that Mr. Vincent Ashford's face had transformed from pleasant surprise to something considerably more complicated. The Christmas music that had been playing in the shop seemed very loud suddenly and very inappropriate. Capítulo 2. Rumores en la Plaza del Pueblo. The body belonged to a man named Harold Wickham, 47 years old, who worked as a warehouse manager for a textile distributor based in Oxford. That much was established within the hour, once the police had arrived and the shop had been secured as a crime scene. Inspector Graves, a man of perhaps 60 with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades listening to lies, had taken charge with quiet efficiency. By noon, the news had spread through Thornfield with the velocity of smoke. By 12:30, it had acquired the texture of legend. Miss Marple sat in the back room of the spinning wheel, with Mrs. Timmins and 3 other ladies of the village council, each cradling a cup of tea as though it might provide answers. Outside, the afternoon light was already fading, the village returning to normal rhythms even as abnormality festered at its heart. "Dead for at least 12 hours, Mrs. Timmins said, having obtained this information from her nephew, who worked for the constabulary. But who on earth would Mrs. Patricia Hartwell, widow of the previous shopkeeper, seemed personally affronted by the whole affair? This was the question that had already spawned a dozen theories. Mrs. Hastings, the greengrocer's wife, leaned forward conspiratorially. "I heard from Dolores at the butcher's that Mr. Ashford wasn't even at the shop last night. Apparently he was at the Swan with some visitors from London." Mrs. Hartwell's eyebrows rose. "Apparently the visitors were business associates," Mrs. Hastings continued, though her tone suggested she found this explanation insufficient. "Men." Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing, though she noted the swift assumption that business disputes and late-night entertainment in the company of men somehow explained a body in the storage room. It rarely did. "I had the impression," Mrs. Timmins ventured carefully, "that Harold Wickham was not the sort of man to inspire such violence. He was quiet, kept to himself." This from Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the doctor's wife, who had a tendency toward philosophical pronouncements. "I was reading in Reader's Digest just last month about a perfectly respectable man in Surrey who turned out to have 3 families in different counties." Miss Marple made a small sound of agreement, though she was thinking of something rather different. The dead man had been in the toy shop. That much was established. But why? Had he been employed there? No, Mr. Ashford had mentioned to the police that Wickham was not known to him, that he couldn't imagine how the man had gained access to the storage room. "There's also the matter of that dreadful woman," Mrs. Hastings added, lowering her voice despite the fact that they were quite alone. "The one with the red hair who was at the opening. I saw her asking questions about Mr. Ashford, where he'd come from, whether he had family." Miss Marple's attention, heretofore polite but divided, sharpened considerably. "Striking, but not quite respectable," Mrs. Hastings said, which in Thornfield was a meaningful distinction. "Navy dress, London tailoring, the sort of woman who looks at you as though she's cataloguing your secrets. I saw her speaking with young Mr. Parkinson as well." Miss Marple asked mildly. "I couldn't hear precisely, but something about inheritance laws and contested wills." Across the village in the solicitor's office on Church Lane, young Mr. Parkinson was having a considerably more animated discussion with Inspector Graves. The inspector, despite his weathered exterior, possessed the sharpness of a man who missed nothing. Graves repeated, his pencil poised over his notebook. "Hypothetically," Parkinson clarified, perhaps more defensively than the question warranted. She said she was interested in legal matters generally. Wished to understand how estates were settled in England. "Except for the timing," Graves observed, and the fact that a man is now dead in the back of Mr. Ashford's toy shop. At the Swan Public House, the evening crowd had begun to gather, and the story had acquired new dimensions with each telling. By the time it had passed through 6 different mouths, Harold Wickham had been variously described as Mr. Ashford's illegitimate brother, a business rival from London, and a blackmailer attempting to extort money from Ashford. "I heard they found a wallet empty," one man offered. "Robbery then." "But he wasn't robbed," another corrected. "Then what was taken?" Around the corner, in the small terraced house on Rosemary Lane, Mr. Vincent Ashford sat in his study, a glass of brandy untouched before him, and wondered how a day of triumph had become a day of catastrophe. He had not known Harold Wickham. This was the truth, and yet it seemed insufficient. People wanted explanations, connections, clear narratives that made sense of chaos. The business associates from London, 2 men named Bramwell and Curtis, both dealing in the import trade, had already given their statements to the police. Ashford had dined with them at the Swan, had discussed the possibility of acquiring a collection of rare German dolls, and had returned to his house by 10 o'clock. He had not set foot in the toy shop until this morning, when he had opened the back door to receive a shipment of Christmas crackers. What he did not mention, and what he intended never to mention, was the letter he had received 3 days prior. The letter from a London solicitor's office regarding an inheritance claim on his late wife's estate. An inheritance that, if valid, would reduce his own holdings substantially. The letter had contained a name: Harold Wickham. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat alone in her cottage as evening deepened into night. The fire crackled pleasantly, and her knitting needles clicked with methodical rhythm, but her mind was occupied with the architecture of motive and opportunity. A man unknown to the shop owner found dead in his storage room. A woman with sharp eyes asking questions about legal matters and Mr. Ashford's past. A letter that ought not to have been sent, or perhaps ought never to have been received. And somewhere in the darkness of Thornfield, someone was thinking about murder, about how close they had come to success, about what they would do if caught. Miss Marple increased the pace of her knitting slightly. The mystery was only beginning. Capítulo 3. Las observaciones discretas. The morning after the discovery brought Inspector Graves back to Thornfield with a team of men who proceeded to catalogue, measure, and examine every inch of celestial treasures. The shop remained closed, a black ribbon of police tape across its door, like a wound that would not heal. Miss Marple, however, had other sources of information. By mid-morning, she had positioned herself at the village post office, ostensibly to purchase stamps, but actually to observe the comings and goings of those connected to the case. The postmistress, Mrs. Eleanor Finch, was a woman who knew more about Thornfield's business than any inspector could hope to discover in a month. "Has Miss Marple asked, examining the sheet of stamps as though each one required profound consideration. Mrs. Finch, delighted to have someone to discuss the matter with, leaned against the counter. "Not at all, which I found rather odd. When he first arrived, he was eager for every package, signing for deliveries personally. But in the last week, everything's been perfunctory." Miss Marple ventured. Mrs. Finch's eyes widened slightly. "However did you know?" "Yes, the Bramwell and Associates letterhead. Miss Marple purchased her stamps and moved on, her mind cataloguing this detail. Legal matters indeed. Inheritance disputes were not uncommon, and they rarely ended well. By afternoon, she had engineered an encounter with Dr. Whitmore in the village chemist's shop. The doctor was collecting a prescription for his wife, and Miss Marple had stationed herself near the patent medicines with the patience of someone who had perfected the art of apparent coincidence. "Dreadful business," the doctor said once pleasantries had been exchanged. "Poor fellow, Wickham. I knew him slightly. Quiet man, kept to himself. His wife died some 5 years ago. Pneumonia, I believe. After that he seemed to diminish somehow." Miss Marple asked. "Not that I'm aware of. He never mentioned relatives." "Idle curiosity," Miss Marple said, which was technically true, though her curiosity was anything but idle. At the spinning wheel, where Miss Marple took her usual late afternoon tea, she encountered Mrs. Hastings and allowed the conversation to drift toward the red-haired woman who had attended the shop opening. Miss Marple asked. "Not today," Mrs. Hastings said, pausing in the act of pouring tea, "though I heard she was at the Swan last evening, having dinner with Mr. Parkinson, which seems rather forward, doesn't it?" "Perhaps they have legal business to discuss," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "At the Swan? Over roasted chicken." Mrs. Hastings lowered her voice. "Between you and me, Miss Marple, I've been wondering whether she might be connected to the crime. She was at the shop opening asking questions, and now a man turns up dead." Miss Marple considered this. It was the sort of reasoning that appealed to the village mind. Dramatic, connected, satisfyingly narrative. But she had learned long ago that coincidence was often precisely what it appeared to be, while the actual mechanics of motive and opportunity were frequently far more prosaic and interconnected than simple cause and effect suggested. "Has anyone discovered what Mr. B?" she asked. "That's just it. No one can explain it. The door was locked from the inside. Mr. Ashford says he's never seen Wickham before." At 4 o'clock, Miss Marple took her regular walk through the village, passing the toy shop with its police tape and its closed door. Through the window, she could see Inspector Graves and one of his constables conducting a final examination. The dolls in the window display still gazed out with their glassy, intelligent eyes, untouched by violence, eternal in their beauty. It was as she turned to leave that she noticed something. A small detail that probably meant nothing, or perhaps meant everything. In the corner of the display, one of the dolls, not the striking one in the peacock blue dress, but a smaller figure in a cream lace gown, had been slightly displaced. Its position had shifted perhaps an inch or two from its fellows. An accident, certainly. Or perhaps not. That evening, Miss Marple received a visitor, the red-haired woman from the shop opening. She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on St. Mary's Lane with the sort of purposefulness that suggested this was not a chance encounter. She gave her name as Miss Sarah Ashford. "I wondered if you might receive me," Sarah said, sitting in the chair opposite Miss Marple's, with the careful posture of someone accustomed to making good impressions. "Please," Miss Marple said, setting aside her knitting, "do tell me your circumstances." "Mr. Vincent Ashford is my uncle," Sarah began carefully. "My father's brother, though they were estranged for many years. I came to Thornfield because I learned that he was establishing himself here, and I hoped to—" "A generous impulse," Miss Marple observed. "Not entirely generous," Sarah admitted. "My father passed 2 years ago, and certain matters regarding his estate have come to light, matters that concern Mr. Ashford directly. I was attempting to gather information to understand the situation before approaching him." She gestured vaguely toward the direction of the toy shop. Miss Marple asked, Sarah hesitated, clearly weighing what to reveal. "There is a question of a contested inheritance from my father's side of the family. My uncle stands to lose a significant portion of his wife's estate if certain claims are upheld." Miss Marple felt the puzzle pieces beginning to move, though they had not yet settled into their proper positions. "That is what troubles me," Sarah said. "He should have known. The solicitor's letter was sent weeks ago. Yet when I arrived and began asking about it, he seemed genuinely surprised. Upset, yes, but surprised. The letter might have been delayed," Miss Marple suggested, "or perhaps Mr. After Sarah had departed, leaving Miss Marple with far more questions than answers, the old woman sat by her fire and reviewed what she now knew. A man dead in a locked room. A disputed inheritance. An uncle and niece with secrets. A solicitor's letter that should have arrived but perhaps hadn't. A woman with sharp eyes and legal questions. And somewhere beneath all of it, a motive. Perhaps not the obvious motive, but something more intricate, more personal, more very human. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again and resumed her work, her needles clicking with the precision of someone solving a puzzle that others could not yet perceive. Capítulo 4. El sospechoso evidente. By the third day of the investigation, Inspector Graves had constructed a case against Vincent Ashford with the methodical precision of a man building a house of cards. Each element placed carefully, each one designed to support the structure, even if the foundation was considerably less solid than he would have preferred. The evidence, as presented to the village magistrate, was circumstantial but compelling. Ashford had motive. The contested inheritance claim that would significantly diminish his wealth, if upheld. He had opportunity. He could have met with Wickham at the toy shop the night before, locked the door behind him after the deed was done, and then established an alibi at the Swan by arriving there at precisely the moment he claimed. The London associates confirmed he had been at dinner, but they admitted they had not seen him throughout the early evening. He could have slipped away, Graves explained to his sergeant. A younger man named Porter, who possessed all the enthusiasm of someone beginning to understand the mechanics of crime investigation. Walked back to the shop, dealt with Wickham, returned to the Swan before anyone noticed his absence. A 15-minute walk, perhaps 20 in winter weather. Porter asked, if he wanted him dead, wouldn't it be easier to simply not meet with him? Because, Graves said, in the tone of a man explaining something obvious, Wickham likely came to Thornfield to confront Ashford directly, perhaps demanding money in exchange for silence, perhaps threatening exposure. The body of Harold Wickham had revealed frustratingly few secrets, no signs of obvious struggle. The man had been poisoned, arsenic, the autopsy suggested, though they were awaiting final confirmation. A small quantity, administered perhaps in tea or something similarly innocuous. Death would have come relatively quickly, the body slumping over the crates where it was found. Easy enough to introduce poison into a beverage, Graves noted. Ashford is a civilized man. He would offer refreshment to a visitor. Wickham accepts, drinks, and within minutes begins to feel unwell. The arrest came on the afternoon of the fourth day. Vincent Ashford was taken into custody with quiet dignity, his silver hair catching the winter sunlight, as he was led from his house toward the police motorcar. The village watched with the complicated emotions that small towns reserved for such occasions. Shock, certainly, but also a sort of grim satisfaction that the mystery had been solved, that order would be restored, that one could return to the comfortable rhythms of daily life. Miss Marple, however, did not return to her comfortable rhythms. She sat in the cottage garden, despite the cold, and knitted with unusual intensity. The needles clicked with agitation rather than their usual meditative rhythm. Something was not right. The case against Ashford was too neat, too readily assembled. In her experience, motive and opportunity arranged themselves so conveniently only when someone was deliberately arranging them. At the spinning wheel, the village consensus had shifted decisively. Even Mrs. Hastings, who had expressed her doubts about Mr. Ashford's character during the previous week, now spoke with conviction about the man's obvious guilt. "Of course it was him," she said to Mrs. Timmins, speaking with the absolute certainty of someone who had never truly entertained any other possibility. "The inheritance, the motive, the opportunity," Miss Marple, listening quietly from her corner table, made a small sound of agreement that could be interpreted as concurrence or mere politeness. Young Mr. Parkinson, the solicitor, looked less certain. He had been called by Inspector Graves to discuss the legal matter of the inheritance claim. What he had learned troubled him sufficiently to visit Miss Marple that evening. "It's irregular," he said, sitting in the same chair Sarah Ashford had occupied. "The claim on Mr. Ashford's wife's estate is legitimate, documented, and apparently quite substantial. But here's what puzzles me. Wickham couldn't have known about it unless someone informed him. The claim was filed through solicitors 3 months ago, but Wickham was a warehouse manager. Precisely. But contacted by whom? To create precisely the appearance we now have," Miss Marple suggested. Parkinson looked uncomfortable. "You don't believe, Miss—" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that guilt and innocence are not always as obvious as we would prefer them to be. And I believe that Inspector Graves is a competent man who is nonetheless eager to close a case that troubles him." At the police station, Vincent Ashford sat in an interrogation room with remarkable composure. He denied the charge flatly, consistently, and without apparent emotion. He had not met with Harold Wickham before the murder. He had not known of any inheritance claim. He had been at the Swan, had dined with Bramwell and Curtis, and had retired early with a headache. He asked Inspector Graves, "Why would I poison him in my own shop, where evidence of the deed would inevitably be discovered?" "Because you're arrogant," Graves said flatly. "Because you assumed you were clever enough to arrange his death and pin it on someone else." "I did not do it," Ashford said, and something in his tone, not emotion but absolute conviction, made even Graves hesitate for a moment. That hesitation was brief. The case against Ashford was presented to the magistrate, who agreed that sufficient evidence existed to proceed with formal charges. The town of Thornfield relaxed into the comfort of resolution. though the comfort was not complete. Something lingered in the air, some sense of incompleteness, though most people attributed it to the mere fact of violence in their peaceful village. Only Miss Marple understood that the sense of incompleteness was something else entirely. It was the presence of truth that had not yet revealed itself. Like a doll in a window display, the real answer was still positioned in plain sight, waiting for someone with sufficient observation to notice that it had been deliberately displaced. Capítulo 5. Detalles que susurran. 3 days after Vincent Ashford's arrest, Miss Marple made a request that seemed entirely innocent to those who granted it. She asked if she might visit the toy shop before it was released from police custody. Inspector Graves, who had taken a liking to the elderly woman's quiet demeanor and evident good sense, permitted her entrance accompanied by Constable Porter. The shop, now devoid of customers and stripped of some of its magic by the intrusion of official investigation, seemed diminished. The window display remained undisturbed, the dolls gazing outward with their eternal glassy serenity. But it was not the window that interested Miss Marple. She moved directly toward the storage room, a space of perhaps 12 feet by 15, lined with shelving units holding inventory awaiting display or shipment. The crates on which Harold Wickham's body had been found were still positioned in the corner, though the body itself had long since been removed to the undertaker's. Miss Marple asked, gesturing toward the crates. "Of course, madam," Porter said, eager to demonstrate his professional courtesy. Miss Marple examined the area with meticulous attention. The crates bore labels indicating they had arrived from Dover 2 days prior, a shipment of Christmas crackers and festive decorations. The paper on top of the uppermost crate was somewhat stained, the result of Wickham's body fluids, but beneath that evidence of death, the crate itself was unremarkable. What caught her attention was not the crates themselves, but what lay beside them. A small wooden box, the sort used for storing delicate items with "fragile" printed on its side in bold red letters. It was shoved partially under the lower shelf, as though hidden or forgotten. Miss Marple asked, pointing. Porter consulted his notes. "That? We catalogued it as additional inventory. Christmas ornaments, I believe, small glass ones." But Miss Marple was already asking if she might examine it. With a constable's assistance, the box was retrieved and opened. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were not Christmas ornaments at all, but documents, letters, certificates, and what appeared to be legal papers, all relating to a property transaction dated 15 years prior. Inspector Graves was summoned, and he arrived within the hour with considerably less patience than he had previously displayed. The box, he determined after cursory examination, contained nothing directly relevant to the murder. The papers related to an old property dispute settled years ago, entirely immaterial. "Wickham must have had them," Graves said dismissively. "Perhaps he kept important papers with him." But Miss Marple, with Graves's permission, spent another hour in the shop, examining the storage room with the intensity of an archaeologist reading a landscape. She asked Porter questions about the timeline of deliveries, about who had access to the shop keys, about the pattern of Mr. Ashford's movements in the days before the murder. Porter, young and earnest, answered everything he knew. But there was one detail that seemed to trouble him even as he spoke it aloud. "It's odd, madam, about the door being locked. Mr. Ashford says Wickham must have locked it from inside after he arrived, but the lock is quite old. Mr. Ashford had mentioned to one of the constables that he'd been meaning to have it replaced. And there's this." Porter led her to the door, a Victorian-era construction of solid oak with a brass lock mechanism that had clearly seen decades of use. This sort of lock, if someone knew the mechanism, could potentially be operated from outside using a thin implement. A key, perhaps, or even a stiff wire. Considerable expertise, I should think. After departing the shop, Miss Marple made her way to the village library, a modest establishment housed in a converted cottage near the church. The librarian, Miss Dorothy Ashfield, was delighted to see her. "I'm attempting to research the history of Thornfield property transactions," Miss Marple explained, "specifically any disputes or transfers from approximately 15 years ago." Miss Ashfield, who loved nothing more than assisting patrons in historical research, produced a bound volume of local newspaper archives. Together, they examined the pages, and there, in an issue from October 15 years prior, was an article describing a contested property sale between two families over a cottage on the outskirts of the village. One of those families was named Wickham, the other was named Hartwell. Miss Marple felt the first real stirring of understanding, though it remained incomplete, like a melody half remembered. She requested permission to examine the article more closely and copied down several names and dates. "Fascinating," Miss Ashfield said. "The Wickhams left Thornfield shortly after that dispute. I believe Harold Wickham moved to Oxford for work." That evening Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Patricia Hartwell, the widow who had previously owned the property that now housed the toy shop. She broached the subject carefully, as though it were merely passing curiosity. "I was reading about an old property dispute," Miss Marple said, "involving your family, I believe, 15 years ago?" Mrs. Hartwell's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "A tedious matter, resolved long ago." "Merely historical curiosity," Miss Marple assured her. "Yes, Harold Wickham and his late wife attempted to claim ownership of a property that had legitimately belonged to my family. It was nonsense, of course. The matter was settled in our favor." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple said gently. "That must have been quite bitter for Mr. "I suppose it was," Mrs. Hartwell said stiffly. "But life is full of disappointments." After leaving Mrs. Hartwell's home, Miss Marple sat on a bench in the village square and examined what she now understood to be a far more intricate puzzle than anyone else had perceived. The inheritance claim on Vincent Ashford's wife's estate. The property dispute from 15 years prior. The box of documents hidden in the storage room. The old lock that could be manipulated by someone with expertise. And somewhere beneath all of these details, a motive that had nothing to do with inheritance and everything to do with vengeance. A circle that had been widening for 15 years, finally closing around an innocent man. Capitulo 6, Secretos que emergen. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mr. Parkinson's solicitor office under the pretense of needing legal advice regarding her will. Parkinson, who recognized this as almost certainly unnecessary, nonetheless received her with professional courtesy and installed her in a chair across from his desk. "I've been thinking about what you said," Miss Marple began, "regarding the inheritance claim and how Harold Wickham might have discovered its existence. I wonder if you might enlighten me about the procedures for such claims." Parkinson hesitated, clearly weighing professional discretion against his instinct that Miss Marple was asking these questions for reasons that transcended idle curiosity. "Someone would have to inform him," he said finally. "And if that someone had a vested interest in Mr. Precisely. Now tell me, when Miss Sarah Ashford consulted you about inheritance law, did she ask about specific claims?" Parkinson's face flushed slightly. "She asked about the procedures for contesting inherited estates, about documentation requirements, about... Did she mention Mr. No, not directly." After Miss Marple left the office, she found herself thinking not about what Parkinson had revealed, but about what he had concealed. The reluctance in his tone when discussing Sarah Ashford, the slight evasion when asked about the specifics of their conversations. Young Mr. Parkinson, it seemed, was experiencing emotions that complicated his professional judgment. She made her way to the Swan Public House, where the proprietor, Mr. Geoffrey Morris, was arranging glasses behind the bar. Morris was a man who had owned the establishment for 20 years, and had therefore acquired the publican's natural talent for reading people and situations. "I wanted to ask about the evening Mr. Ashford dined here," Miss Marple said, after they had exchanged pleasantries. "With Bramwell and Curtis, the men from London." "Most of the evening, yes. They were quite animated, discussing business, dolls and decorations mostly." "And did Mr. Morris consider this carefully?" "Not entirely. He excused himself at one point, perhaps 20 minutes or so, said he needed to check something at his home. He returned looking somewhat agitated, if I'm honest. Perhaps 8 o'clock? The timing, Miss Marple noted, corresponded precisely with the window in which the poison could have been administered. A walk of 20 minutes would have been sufficient to reach the toy shop, meet with Wickham, offer him refreshment, and depart before returning to the Swan. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visitor at her cottage, Sarah Ashford, looking considerably less composed than she had during their previous meeting. The young woman's hands trembled slightly as she accepted tea. "I've been thinking about what I told you," Sarah said without preamble. "About coming to Thornfield to repair family connections." "I suspected as much," Miss Marple said gently. Sarah set down her teacup with careful precision. "My father and my uncle had a terrible falling out many years ago. Over a woman, actually, my uncle's late wife. My father was in love with her, but she chose Vincent. My father never recovered from that disappointment. When he died, he left instructions in his will that Vincent's inheritance, which came through his wife, should be contested, not asked, instructed. I was his executor, and the instructions were quite clear. Not initially, but when I arrived in Thornfield, I began investigating. I discovered that Wickham had once had a claim on a property that my uncle's wife had inherited, a property that formed part of the estate in question. I found him through old legal records. Miss Marple felt the pieces aligning, though not yet into the picture that Inspector Graves had constructed. Yes, and I told him that if he could provide documentation supporting his original claim, it might be used to challenge my uncle's current holdings. I thought he would be interested in reopening the old dispute, perhaps seeking financial compensation. I'm not certain, but I suspect it was 2 days before the murder. Once, I gave him copies of the property documents from the old dispute. He seemed eager, almost consumed with the idea of confronting my uncle. Miss Marple set down her own teacup. Sarah's face went very pale. I mean that a woman dies, leaving an estate to a man she married very recently. That same man later becomes involved in a business enterprise, a toy shop, that proves to be the location of a murder. You're suggesting? I'm suggesting nothing. I'm merely observing patterns. Tell me, did you inform anyone else in Thornfield about the inheritance dispute? About Mr. Sarah hesitated, her expression troubled. Mrs. Patricia Hartwell. I met her at a church social, and she mentioned the old property dispute. I was curious, so I told her about Wickham and the inheritance claim. She seemed very interested. Miss Marple felt something shift in the architecture of the mystery. I didn't ask, but she mentioned that Wickham had caused her considerable harm years ago. After Sarah had left, Miss Marple sat in contemplation as afternoon light shifted toward evening. The case against Vincent Ashford suddenly seemed like a structure built on sand. Impressive to the casual observer, but fundamentally unstable when examined closely. She rose from her chair with quiet determination and made her way toward the home of Patricia Hartwell, an elderly widow with unfinished business and 15 years of accumulated resentment. It was time, Miss Marple thought, to discover what truly lay beneath the surface of the mystery. What had been hidden not in locked rooms or poisoned beverages, but in the hearts of those who had learned to disguise their wounds as respectability. Capítulo 7. El Segundo Hero. Patricia Hartwell's house stood at the edge of the village, a Victorian cottage that had been in her family for 3 generations. It was the sort of property that spoke of old money and settled respectability, well-maintained gardens, mullioned windows, a black door with brass fittings that gleamed with careful attention. Miss Marple knocked twice, received no response, and tried the door. It was unlocked. "Mrs.?" she called, stepping into a hallway lined with family portraits and antique furniture. The house possessed that particular silence of spaces recently abandoned. Not the silence of a house simply waiting for its occupant to return, but the silence of departure. The drawing room was immaculate, perhaps too immaculate, as though someone had deliberately ensured that no evidence of their presence remained. But in the study, Miss Marple discovered something that suggested otherwise. A letter, unsealed, addressed to Inspector Graves, sitting on the desk with a paperweight holding it in place. Miss Marple read it without hesitation. She was, after all, attempting to prevent a grave injustice. The letter contained a confession of sorts, though not to murder. Patricia Hartwell wrote that she had deliberately orchestrated the circumstances that had led to Harold Wickham's presence in Thornfield. She acknowledged her resentment of Wickham stemming from the property dispute 15 years prior, a dispute she wrote that had been far more consequential than the public record suggested. She had lost more than property in that affair. She had lost her son. The letter explained in careful, measured prose that her son had been in love with Wickham's wife at the time of the dispute. The scandal had been suppressed, the affair terminated, and her son, unable to bear the shame, had taken his own life 6 months after the Wickhams departed Thornfield. When Sarah Ashford had mentioned Wickham and the inheritance claim, Hartwell had seen an opportunity for the restitution that 15 years of silence had been unable to provide. She had deliberately ensured that Wickham would come to Thornfield. She had provided him with documents, with encouragement, with the false promise that his grievances might finally be addressed. But she had not poisoned him. This she stated clearly in the letter. She had provided the information that led to his presence in Thornfield, nothing more. She would not confess to a murder she had not committed. The letter concluded with the statement that she was departing Thornfield immediately and permanently, and that she trusted justice, actual justice, not the convenient fabrication that had been constructed around Vincent Ashford's arrest, would eventually prevail. Miss Marple stood very still, holding the letter, as the architecture of the mystery reorganized itself around this new information. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she nearly missed the sound. A car engine stopping outside the house. Inspector Graves entered moments later, accompanied by Constable Porter, and surprisingly a man Miss Marple did not recognize, a London inspector by his bearing, formal and distinctly metropolitan. "Miss Marple," Graves said, taking in her presence with minimal surprise, "I might have known you would be here. Did Mrs. "I was attempting to speak with her," Miss Marple said, extending the letter. Graves read it carefully, his expression hardening as he proceeded through its contents. When he had finished, he handed it to his London colleague. "This changes matters considerably," the London inspector said. His name was Crawford, and he had arrived that morning with evidence that would have transformed the entire investigation, had Miss Marple not already begun to perceive the truth. "Mr. Ashford did not purchase the toy shop with funds of his own," Crawford explained. "He purchased it with money provided by his late wife's family. Money that should have been dispersed according to her will, but the will was altered approximately 8 months ago. A codicil was added that redirected a significant portion of the estate to Mr. Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The wife," Crawford said. "Or, to be precise, someone using her name and signature." The implications settled over the room like winter fog. The inheritance claim on Ashford's wife's estate was not designed to restore funds to her family. It was designed to initiate an investigation into the circumstances of her death, and more importantly, into the validity of the will that had been altered after her death. "Someone knew about the altered will," Miss Marple said slowly. "Someone who understood that if Wickham's claim was pursued, it would inevitably lead to scrutiny of the wife's estate and its disposition." Graves looked at her with sudden understanding. "You're saying Ashford is guilty after all? That he forged the will? That Wickham discovered this and—" "I'm saying nothing of the sort," Miss Marple interrupted quietly. "I'm saying that there is a third party involved. The niece," Porter said suddenly. "Sarah Ashford. She's an executor." But Miss Marple shook her head. "Miss Ashford's involvement, while misguided, was primarily about executing her father's wishes regarding the inheritance dispute," Graves demanded. "The woman who employed Wickham, unknowingly, as a mechanism for uncovering a crime far more elaborate than a simple murder in a toy shop storage room," Miss Marple said. "At that very moment, at the railway station in the next village over, the London solicitor who had processed the alterations to the will was purchasing a ticket for the north. She had observed, through careful attention to local newspapers and village gossip networks, that the investigation into Wickham's death was beginning to shift in uncomfortable directions. It was time to disappear, to relocate to Manchester or Liverpool, to become one more anonymous person among millions. But she had not counted on the fact that Miss Marple, even in her cottage knitting ordinary socks, was engaged in observation of a sophistication that most professionals would never achieve. Capítulo 8. El Juego de la Verdad. Eleanor Thorne was stopped at the railway station at 4:30 on the afternoon following Patricia Hartwell's departure. Inspector Graves had wired ahead to the station master with a description. and Thorn was brought back to Thornfield under circumstances that suggested courtesy rather than arrest. A distinction that likely failed to comfort her. She was a woman of perhaps 55, with carefully maintained hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to professional respectability. She had worked as a solicitor in London for 28 years, maintaining an impeccable reputation and a clientele that included several prominent families. She was, to all appearances, exactly the sort of woman who should never be suspected of forgery or manipulation, which was precisely why Miss Marple had asked to conduct the initial conversation with her. They met in the vicar's study, a neutral space chosen deliberately, not threatening enough to provoke panic, but formal enough to suggest the seriousness of the situation. Inspector Graves waited outside, understanding that Miss Marple's method required a certain degree of privacy and psychological space. "Miss Thorn," Miss Marple began, settling into a chair with the ease of someone about to engage in a pleasant conversation, "I have been thinking about the extraordinary complexity of the situation that has unfolded in our village." Eleanor Thorn remained silent, her hands folded precisely in her lap. "You see," Mrs. Marple continued, picking up her knitting. She had brought it with her, as she always did. "I have observed over many years that guilt manifests not always in dramatic confessions, but in the small choices we make when we believe ourselves to be unobserved. The way we speak about people we have wronged." "I don't know what you're implying," Thorn said carefully. "I'm not implying anything, dear." Miss Marple's needles clicked with meditative rhythm. "You see, when one forges a will, alters a document that is meant to distribute a deceased person's property, one creates a problem that only becomes more complicated as time progresses. Initially, one might believe the deception will never be discovered. But then, circumstances shift. New claims emerge. New investigations begin." Thorn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The question that troubled me," Miss Marple said, "was how such a person would attempt to resolve this dilemma. They could not simply disappear. That would draw attention. They could not produce the forged document. That would invite scrutiny." "You have no evidence of any forgery," Thorn said, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. "Perhaps not yet," Miss Marple agreed. "But I suspect that when Inspector Graves and his colleagues examine the will more carefully, when they compare the signature with other documents in your professional files, they will discover certain inconsistencies. They will find that you had access to the deceased woman's papers. They will discover correspondence between you and Mr. Thorn stood abruptly. "Of course you do," Miss Marple said without looking up from her knitting. "Though I suspect most solicitors in London would not be willing to represent you, given your profession and the nature of the alleged crime." She set down her knitting and looked directly at Eleanor Thorn, her aged eyes possessing an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. "Harold Wickham did not need to die," Miss Marple said quietly. "He came to Thornfield because he had been given reason to believe that his old grievances might be addressed. He was not a threat to you specifically. You had successfully concealed the forgery from everyone, including Mr. Ashford himself. But you poisoned him anyway. Or you arranged for him to be poisoned." "I didn't," Thorn began. "You directed Mr. Ashford toward the Swan on the evening of the murder," Miss Marple continued, her voice never rising, never becoming accusatory, merely stating facts as one might state the time of day. "You knew he kept poison in his home, a commonplace substance purchased years ago for legitimate purposes. You ensured that Wickham would be in the toy shop at a specific time. Thorne's face had gone very pale. That's absurd. You can't possibly. When did you first become involved with Mr. Miss Marple asked. Was it before or after his wife died? I'm not answering any more questions, Thorne said, moving toward the door. Of course not, Miss Marple said. But I would ask you to consider this. You have confessed, through your attempt to flee, that you understand something is wrong. An innocent woman would not run. An innocent woman would not remain silent. Thorne stopped, her hand on the doorframe. However, Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting, cooperation at this stage might be viewed favourably by a court. Eleanor Thorne stood frozen in the doorway, understanding with sudden, terrible clarity that she had been manoeuvred into a position from which there was no escape. Not through flight, not through silence, not through any of the careful professional strategies that had served her so well in her legal career. She had been undone by a woman in her 80s who knitted socks and observed human nature with the precision of a scientist studying specimens. Capitulo 9, La Verdad Expuesta. Eleanor Thorne sat across from Inspector Graves in an interrogation room that was considerably less comfortable than the vicar's study. Miss Marple was present, though she occupied a position that suggested she was merely listening rather than conducting the interview. Sometimes the truth emerged more readily when a person believed they were speaking primarily to authority rather than to the individual who had unmasked them. Thorne had requested and been granted a solicitor, though not one from London. A local man named Thornton, competent but not brilliant, sat beside her and advised her that remaining silent was her right. But Thorne, having reached the point where silence seemed more dangerous than confession, had chosen to speak. I met Vincent Ashford 7 years ago, she began, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone reciting facts she had rehearsed many times in her mind. He came to my firm regarding estate planning. His wife, Margaret, was ill. Cancer, though he did not discuss the details. Graves asked. No, not then. Margaret died 3 years ago, and Vincent was devastated. He came to me to address the distribution of her estate. I comforted him during that period. We became closer. Within 2 years we were intimate, though he was reluctant to formalize any relationship. Miss Marple observed the woman carefully, noting the slight inflection that suggested Thorne had not been content with an indefinite arrangement. Not decided precisely, Thorne said. It evolved. Vincent had invested heavily in the toy shop venture, a considerable sum. He was concerned that if anything happened to him, the store would be seized to cover taxes on his wife's estate. I told myself I was protecting him, Thorne said, and Miss Marple heard the desperate conviction in her voice, the voice of someone who had constructed an elaborate justification for an action that was inherently criminal. A codicil that redirected a portion of Margaret's estate to Vincent's control would ensure his financial security. I drafted it carefully. I used Margaret's signature from existing documents. You forged her signature, Graves said flatly. Yes, Thorne whispered. Yes, I panicked. I realized that if the will came under scrutiny, everything would be exposed. Vincent would face charges. He was innocent of the forgery, but he would be implicated in its consequences. I would face professional ruin. So you killed Harold Wickham, Graves said. Thorne flinched. Not directly, I couldn't. I'm not a violent person. But I understood that if Wickham died, the investigation would shift focus. The inheritance claim would become secondary to a murder investigation. Vincent would be blamed. He had clear motive, given the contested estate. You poisoned him yourself, Miss Marple said quietly. It was not a question. No, I arranged for it to happen. I met with Wickham. He didn't know who I was careful about that. I told him I had information regarding the toy shop ownership, that Vincent Ashford had come into possession of the property through fraudulent means. And you knew he would come to Thornfield, Miss Marple said. I was nearly certain. He was bitter about the property dispute. The prospect of exposing another fraud committed by the same man was irresistible to him. I then contacted Vincent anonymously through a letter and suggested that if Wickham came to Thornfield, it would be to blackmail him. But you added poison to the beverage, Graves prompted. I provided Vincent with tea to serve to Wickham. I told him it was merely a precaution, that if Wickham became difficult, Vincent could administer a mild sedative to calm him before negotiating. The amount was small, I said. But it wasn't a sedative, Graves said. No, it was arsenic, a moderate dose. However, Wickham did not leave, Miss Marple said, understanding flooding through her. He became ill almost immediately. Perhaps he had a weak heart. Perhaps the poison was more potent than you realized. Vincent called me in a panic, Thorne continued, her composure cracking slightly. He said Wickham had collapsed, that he didn't know what to do. I told him to lock the door, to say nothing, to let me think. You deliberately framed an innocent man, Graves said, his voice carrying a contempt that seemed almost physically to strike Thorne. I knew he would survive it, Thorne said desperately. I believed that once the truth about Wickham's visit and the inheritance claim emerged, once investigators looked more carefully, they would realize Vincent couldn't have poisoned him. They would see that someone else must have been involved. You thought that the investigation would be so focused on Vincent that no one would look closely at the will, Miss Marple said. Thorne said nothing, but her silence was confirmation enough. The insurance policy, Miss Marple said, turning to Graves. I suspect you will find that Eleanor Thorne purchased a substantial insurance policy on Vincent Ashford's life approximately 18 months ago, named herself as beneficiary. Thorne's face collapsed, and she began to weep, not the composed tears of remorse, but the ragged sobs of someone confronting the complete destruction of everything she had constructed. Eleanor Thorne had been motivated not by love for Vincent Ashford, but by the desperate belief that she could secure a future with him through manipulation and crime. She had forged a will. She had orchestrated a murder. And in doing so, she had destroyed not only Vincent Ashford's immediate future, but also her own professional reputation and her freedom. All because she could not accept that a man's affection was not a possession to be captured through control. All because she had believed herself clever enough to construct an elaborate deception that would never be unraveled. All because she had failed to account for the presence of a woman in her 80s who sat in a cottage and observed the world with the clarity of someone who had spent 84 years learning how people behaved when they believed no one was watching. Capítulo 10. El regreso a la normalidad. Vincent Ashford was released from custody on a grey morning in mid-December. His name cleared, his reputation damaged but not destroyed. The evidence against him, motive, opportunity, the appearance of guilt, had been constructed so carefully that his exoneration required a meticulous dismantling of that same structure, piece by piece. The toy shop remained closed, its window display of dolls untouched, their glassy eyes continuing to regard the village with eternal serenity. But the magic that had seemed to inhabit the shop on opening day had dissipated. The dolls now appeared less enchanting and more vaguely sinister, witnesses to murder and deception that they could never articulate. Miss Marple observed all of this from her usual position at the spinning wheel, where the village's collective consciousness was undergoing its own transformation. The comfortable narrative that had seemed to resolve itself so neatly, the guilty man arrested, justice served, had been replaced by a far more unsettling truth. That someone respectable, someone professional, someone who had seemed entirely trustworthy, had been capable of both forgery and murder. "It's extraordinary," Mrs. Timmins said, stirring her tea with more vigor than strictly necessary. "Eleanor Thorne, a solicitor. People are rarely what they appear," Miss Marple observed mildly. "But surely there must have been signs," Mrs. Hastings protested. "Some indication that she was capable of such crimes?" Miss Marple asked. "I have found that murder is rarely the result of a sudden transformation." The conversation drifted away, as village conversations do, toward less philosophical and more practical concerns. The Christmas season was approaching. There were parties to organize, gifts to purchase, the normal machinery of seasonal celebration to engage. But something fundamental had shifted in Thornfield. The village had been reminded, through Eleanor Thorne's exposure, that evil did not announce itself through dramatic gestures or obvious malice. It operated quietly, professionally, within the respectable framework of daily life. Sarah Ashford, who had inadvertently set the entire tragedy in motion, had departed for London with a letter of apology to her uncle and a weight of guilt that would take considerably longer to diminish than the train journey required. She had visited Miss Marple before leaving, hoping perhaps to find absolution in the old woman's understanding. "I never intended any of this," Sarah had said, sitting in the same chair where Eleanor Thorne had eventually confessed. "I was simply attempting to execute my father's wishes. I thought—" "You were pursuing vengeance," Miss Marple had replied gently, "dressed in the language of justice. Your father's resentment toward your uncle, unresolved for decades, required an outlet. You provided it. Time may provide what words cannot," Miss Marple had said. "Your uncle is a man with considerable capacity for understanding." On the morning before Christmas, Vincent Ashford appeared at the spinning wheel, having apparently decided that confronting the village was preferable to hiding away in his damaged reputation. He ordered tea and took a seat near the window, his silver hair catching the weak winter sunlight. Most of the village's women found reasons to greet him, their conversations carefully constructed to convey both sympathy and a desire to distance themselves from contamination. By proximity to scandal, one risked acquiring scandal's taint, even if entirely innocent. Miss Marple, however, engaged him in actual conversation. "The shop will reopen," she observed. It was not a question. "Eventually," Ashford said, "I have decided to change the inventory focus. Instead of the sort of sophisticated dolls that attracted Eleanor's attention, I will stock simpler toys. Things that children actually wish to play with, rather than display." "A wise decision," Miss Marple said. "I have been thinking," Ashford continued, "about Margaret's will, the original one before Eleanor's alteration. In truth, she left far more to her family than Eleanor's forgery suggested. Eleanor's codicil actually reduced my inheritance significantly, though neither she nor I fully grasped this at the time." "Love weaponized as control," Miss Marple observed. Ashford asked. "I suspect," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Eleanor Thorne loved the idea of you far more than she could have loved you as you actually are. And when the distinction between idea and reality became impossible to ignore, she chose to commit terrible acts in service of maintaining her fantasy." Ashford nodded, acknowledging a truth he had perhaps already begun to understand. As Christmas approached, the village underwent its traditional transformation. Holly and ivy adorned doorways, evergreen garlands hung from lampposts, the carol singers practiced for their rounds, and the church prepared for its Christmas Eve service. The murder, Eleanor Thorne's confession, Vincent Ashford's exoneration, all of it began to settle into the category of village legend, stories to be told and retold, gradually acquiring the patina of mythology. Miss Marple sat in her cottage on Christmas Eve, her knitting needles quiet for once, a finished scarf of deep blue wool folded on her lap. She had spent the afternoon knitting, as she always did, but her thoughts had been occupied with something quite different from the mechanical motions of the needles. She reflected on Eleanor Thorne's conviction that she had been clever enough to construct a deception that would never unravel. She thought about Sarah Ashford's misguided attempt to execute her father's vengeance. She considered Vincent Ashford, who had nearly died under the weight of false accusation, preserved only by the intervention of an elderly woman who had been observant enough to notice small details. And she understood, as she had understood many times before, that human nature remained remarkably constant. People believed what they wished to believe. They saw what they expected to see. They constructed elaborate justifications for their own actions, even when those actions were criminal. But people also, occasionally, were observed, truly observed, by someone patient enough to look carefully and wise enough to understand what they saw. The village of Thornfield returned to normalcy, its routines restored, its secrets buried once more beneath the surface of respectable society. The toy shop would reopen, life would continue, and in the fullness of time, Eleanor Thorne's crime would become merely another chapter in the village's history. But Miss Marple would not forget. She never forgot. And somewhere in her careful observations of human nature, she had learned once again what she had known for 84 years, that evil often wore the face of respectability, that love could become possession, and that the most dangerous people were often those who believed themselves too clever to be caught. Capítulo 11. Reflexiones en la noche de Navidad. The church bells rang at midnight on Christmas Eve. their sound carrying across the frozen village with crystalline clarity. Miss Marple stood at her cottage window, watching the lights of Thornfield twinkle against the darkness. Warm yellow rectangles that spoke of families gathered, of warmth sought against the winter cold, of the ancient human need for connection and safety. She thought of Eleanor Thorne, now in custody awaiting trial, her carefully constructed professional identity dismantled, her future reduced to the confines of a prison cell. She thought of how that woman had believed herself capable of controlling outcomes through intelligence and manipulation, only to discover that human nature remained irreducibly complex, resistant to the sort of precise engineering that Eleanor had attempted to impose upon it. It was a lesson Miss Marple had learned repeatedly across her long life, that people could be observed, understood, anticipated, but never truly controlled. Eleanor Thorne had failed to account for this fundamental truth, believing instead that careful planning and professional competence could substitute for genuine understanding of the messy, unpredictable business of human emotion. The toy shop would reopen in January, Vincent Ashford had informed her. He had decided to keep the dolls in the window display, though he acknowledged that they had acquired an unfortunate history. Miss Marple thought this was a wise decision. Objects could not be blamed for bearing witness to tragedy, and to remove them would be to allow Eleanor Thorne's crime to dictate the terms of normalcy. There was, Miss Marple believed, something almost defiant in the act of continuing to display those dolls, in asserting that beauty and innocence need not be destroyed by exposure to evil. The dolls remained what they had always been: beautiful, intricate, lifeless objects. It was only human projection that had transformed them into witnesses or symbols. The dolls themselves were innocent, much like Vincent Ashford, who had been rendered temporarily guilty by circumstance and suspicion, only to be restored to innocence through patient investigation and careful observation. Harold Wickham's death, Miss Marple reflected, had been the most straightforward tragedy in the entire affair. He had been a man nursing a legitimate grievance from 15 years past, a man whose wife had died and left him diminished, a man seeking some small measure of acknowledgement that an injustice had been done to him. He had been used by Eleanor Thorne, manipulated through his own bitterness and resentment into becoming an instrument of her plan. In another timeline, one in which Eleanor Thorne had not forged the will, in which she had not panicked at the prospect of exposure, Wickham would have lived. His inheritance claim would have proceeded through the proper legal channels. The matter would have been resolved, disappointingly for him perhaps, but without violence. He would have returned to Oxford, would have continued his quiet life, would eventually have died peacefully in his bed. But Eleanor Thorne's fear, her desperate, consuming need to control the outcome of her relationship with Vincent Ashford, had transformed a simple legal dispute into a murder. She had poisoned Wickham, had attempted to frame an innocent man, and in doing so had destroyed multiple lives for the sake of maintaining an illusion. This was what struck Miss Marple most profoundly. that evil was rarely grand or motivated by spectacular ambition. It was instead the product of ordinary people, attempting to preserve ordinary desires through extraordinary means. Eleanor Thorne had not poisoned Wickham out of ideology or cosmic malice. She had done it out of fear, out of the desperate conviction that her world was collapsing and that violence was the only mechanism available to prevent that collapse. It was this ordinariness of evil that most people failed to understand. They looked for monsters, for individuals who were fundamentally different from themselves, for creatures incapable of moral feeling or human connection. But the worst crimes, Miss Marple had learned, were committed by people who were not monsters at all. They were committed by people very much like everyone else. People who had simply made a series of choices that led them incrementally toward actions they would once have believed themselves incapable of committing. A knock at her door interrupted her reverie. Miss Marple opened it to find Sarah Ashford standing in the cold, having apparently decided to return to Thornfield rather than depart on the early train as planned. "I couldn't leave without speaking with you once more," Sarah said. "I needed to understand, was my father's vengeance worth this?" Miss Marple invited her inside, settled her by the fire, and took her time in responding. "Your father's resentment," Miss Marple said carefully, "was understandable if not justified. He had loved unwisely and suffered for it. That suffering never truly diminished, and so he instructed you to pursue his vengeance even beyond his death." "You're saying his vengeance led to Wickham's death," Sarah said quietly. "I'm saying that your father's unresolved rage created circumstances that Eleanor Thorne weaponized. Had you never come to Thornfield, had you never pursued the inheritance claim, Harold Wickham would still be alive." Sarah remained silent, understanding that no comfort Miss Marple could offer would adequately resolve the weight of that knowledge. Sarah asked finally. "You live," Miss Marple said simply, "as all of us must live, with the knowledge that we are capable of both good and harm, that our best intentions can produce terrible consequences, and that the only honest response to this truth is humility and careful attention to the welfare of others. Your father never achieved this humility. Eleanor Thorne never achieved it." After Sarah had departed, truly departed this time, returning to London with a quieter heart, if not a lighter one, Miss Marple returned to her window. The village had settled into the deep silence of Christmas night, a silence that felt almost sacred in its completeness. She thought about the dolls in the toy shop window, beautiful and unchanging, eternal in their serenity. She thought about how human beings, unlike those dolls, were condemned to feel, to desire, to fear, and how those fundamental capacities could lead us toward either great love or terrible cruelty. The mystery of the toy shop where dolls had witnessed murder had resolved itself not through dramatic revelation but through patient observation, through Miss Marple's willingness to notice small details, to question obvious conclusions, and to understand that the architecture of crime was rarely as straightforward as it initially appeared. As the fire crackled before her, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The needle clicked with the rhythm of certainty, the rhythm of someone who had learned to read human nature as clearly as others read printed words. Another scarf would emerge from her work, something warm and useful, something that would protect someone against the winter cold. And the village of Thornfield, having glimpsed the darkness that could hide beneath respectability, would continue onward into the future, carrying with it the knowledge that evil was not always obvious, that safety was always provisional, and that only through careful attention to the world around us could we hope to prevent tragedy. The dolls in the window remained, watching and unchanging, as human lives continued their complicated, consequential dance below.